IPO. How should Celtic Tiger Ireland remember the Ireland of Easter 1916? Well, Hollywood may have used dramatic license when it recreated the Easter Rising for the movie Michael Collins. But the filmmakers are not alone in shaping history to their purposes. And 1916 has been used and abused to justify often wildly different views of our past and present. Now the state says it wants to reclaim the true legacy of the Rising. While our president extols the virtues of its leaders, our Taoiseach plans a full military parade in their honour. Tonight we'll be debating the history behind the government's plans and their impact on our future. But first, Ken O'Shea asks, why all the newfound interest in the events of Easter 1916?
Easter 1916, the glorious failure that became the defining moment in Ireland's fight for nationhood, the touchstone for Irish nationalism. And after more than 3 decades in the wilderness, obscured by a new armed struggle and revisionism, the Easter Rising is back at the heart of Irish political life. After 90 years, it seems it's finally cool to wrap the flag around us again.
Next Easter Sunday, we're going to reintroduce the parade to commemorate 1916.
So what happened to the spirit, the memory of 1916? During the 50th anniversary celebrations in 1966, it seemed the Rising would always be the focus point of Irish nationalism. Taoiseach Sean Lemass and President Eamon de Valera, 2 veterans with proud records, led the nation in a sombre, militaristic commemoration.
66 was, I would say, a once-off. It was a big 50th anniversary event. I think the person who really had ownership of it was Sean Lemass. He said, when he was asked at the press conference, what are we marking? He said, we were marking an important and decisive moment in our history, and that is all.
Post-66, everything changed, and it's only now that the image of 1916 is finally being rehabilitated. The last time the old HQ got this sort of attention was in 1966, in advance of the 50th anniversary ceremonies. The intervening years, of course, have belonged to a different type of Republican volunteer. For over 30 years, the Provisional IRA annexed and occupied the memory of 1916. What had been a shared national heritage became a narrow historical justification for a new armed campaign.
In some ways, it was safe by the time of the mid-60s at the 50th anniversary of 1916 for the state and others to get involved in the occasion. It became unsafe again in the late 60s when the Troubles began in the north, and the annual Easter parade itself was no longer held.
I think certainly in later years, I think people felt a bit concerned and a bit worried and a bit fearful in actually citing 1916 because I think there were concerns that it could be taken out of context. I think it's very easy to misrepresent historical events in trying to slot them into the present.
Well, since 1966 in particular, they failed miserably to acknowledge how the state was founded, where it came from, or the basic principles which the founding leaders had when they sought to establish a republic on the whole island.
Last week's speech by President Mary McAleese was the latest step on the road to recovery for the Easter Rising. Strongly favouring the traditional version of events, the Rising as glorious martyrdom and the cause of freedom, the President appealed for its rehabilitation in a modern Ireland.
Well, I think certainly it was something that can further debate. I think that she has taken the lead, as it were, in putting all of those events out there for further discussion.
I think it's a pity that the Taoiseach, and much more so the President, who should be above party, engage in this sort of appropriation of an aspect of the Irish past for a political purpose, or in the case of the President, appear to do so.
Some people have attacked her for having the gall to speak about 1916. I think that's kind of the closed mindset, this kind of bigotry that is out there against any type of discussion of republicanism and its future. And I think she did put it, in fairness to her, in a context and invited the debate.
The rehabilitation of the Rising also reflects a changed political landscape. Since the early 70s, Northern nationalists have taken ownership of Easter 1916. Sinn Féin's new ambitions in the south has sent the other parties rushing back to the barricades. A new fight for the Irish flag has begun.
The Irish people need to reclaim the spirit of 1916, which is not the property of those who have abused and debased the title of republicanism.
I think Fianna Fáil are trying to take over an aspect of the past, to exclude Sinn Féin, to show that we, Fianna Fáil, are the greenest party, at least the greenest big party, the greenest party that has a chance of government. Therefore, don't bother with Sinn Féin, who are ultimately irrelevant in power terms.
The Taoiseach and others, and I don't think it would be any different if Enda Kenny and Pat Rabbitte were in government, the Taoiseach and MacDougall and others, are anxious in a sense for the state, the nation, to claim back the celebration and commemoration of 1916 rather than to leave it to proxy or ad hoc operations like, say, a Sinn Féin celebration or otherwise.
The argument illustrates the core reality of 1916. All Irish politics, even at a 90-year remove, draws its heritage from those guerrilla days on Dublin's streets.
It's important to realise that it isn't just one group that claim their immediate links with 1916. That we in Fianna Fáil feel very, very strongly that our route as a party has been very well established in all of that particular philosophy and all of that ethos.
Well, Fine Gael is the United Ireland Party. We always have been. We firmly believe in constitutional nationalism.
Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael have it within the constitution of their parties that they seek Irish unity. The problem is that they haven't managed to do much about it since the founding of the state. Whereas at Sinn Féin, we've continued to try and achieve that aim.
This recent scramble to wrap the green flag around oneself isn't helpful. I believe that it actually debases the actual flag itself.
Last night, the government confirmed that a military parade would form the centrepiece of this year's 90th anniversary ceremonies. With the 100th anniversary looming, it's a clear signal that the state is finally ready to embrace the memory of 1916.
I think it's perfectly appropriate for any state to mark any event that they see is central to its particular history or its cultural traditions.
The commemoration, the celebrations themselves should bring in as many voices so that you have a vibrant debate, you have a celebration, it's colourful. It's not just kind of a sombre parade. It's not just about commemorating. We have to look how 1916 has influenced the present and how it can influence the future.
We've got to decide where they stand in history and how we're actually going to commemorate them. For long enough, we have actually buried our history.
I think there is something mature about being able to commemorate an event, to debate and argue about an event. Some will celebrate, some will not celebrate the event that was Easter 1916, but it's no harm to mark it.
Every other country, or the vast majority of countries, celebrate their Day of Independence. And I think it's appropriate that we do that now on this occasion.
That was Ken O'Shea reporting. Well, we felt we'd all benefit from a few considered and uninterrupted thoughts from both sides in the debate about the planned commemoration of the Rising. So we've invited two people with very different views, Martin Mansergh and Diarmuid Ferriter, to kick-start our debate tonight. First, let's hear from Martin Mansergh, a Fianna Fáil senator, well known for his role as advisor to successive Taoiseach. Senator.
Ireland has come a long way in 90 years. We have been able to achieve much more and to win international respect because we have made good use of the advantage of being a separate, independent country, taking our place among the nations. The Act of Union of 1800 had sought to prevent that for all time, and from O'Connell to Redmond, every suggested compromise was frustrated. The First World War was the cataclysm that sealed the fate of empires and opened the door to rising nations. The 1916 rebellion reinstated Ireland's demand for complete independence, enabling us to become one of the new post-war states formed in accordance with the right to national self-determination. How can we be sure when there would have been another, more peaceful opportunity? The ideal of national democracy based on universal suffrage, for which the 1916 leaders sacrificed themselves, was massively endorsed by the Irish people in the general election of 1918. The ideals of the proclamation, the founding charter of this state, partly inspired by Tone, Emmett and Davis, were egalitarian and inclusive, cherishing all the children of the nation equally. No matter what our background or the difficulties our forebears faced, we can all take pride in the success of our country today, the best realization of the Republican ideal to date. Unfortunately, earlier omissions and later wrong turnings contributed to prolonged and tragic conflict in Northern Ireland. The painstaking construction of peace still faces some difficulties. Reconciliation needs to be based on mutual respect and right understanding for diverse traditions, cultures and achievements. The state engages in and supports a broad range of commemorations. St. Patrick's Day, with its universal appeal, remains the national day. The state will honour 1916 as the catalyst for its own formation. The planned ceremonies and parade will also very much reflect the Ireland of today.
Thank you, Senator. Well, to put the case against government plans for the commemoration of the Rising is historian Diarmuid Ferriter, author of The Transformation of Ireland. Diarmuid.
In 1935, William Cosgrave, the leader of the first government of the Irish Free State, criticised the then Fianna Fáil government for their attempt to monopolise the commemoration of the 1916 Rising. It is always unseemly, if not indecent, he said, for political parties to engage in a figurative scramble for the bones of the patriot dead. His words 71 years later are more apt than ever. What has been witnessed over the last few months has been unseemly, has polarised opinion, and has raised the question of the deliberate abuse of history in order to satisfy contemporary political needs. It is quite clear at this stage that any commemoration of 1916 is not going to be about what happened and why, but how a selective use of the events of 90 years ago can be employed by those wishing to wrap the green flag around themselves in order to gain the high moral ground and out-republicanise their opponents. Commemorations tell us more about contemporary opinion polls than they do about the event being commemorated. Historians have done much over the past 20 years to attempt to broaden the interpretation of 1916. They have documented the women who for so long were written out of the 1916 story. They have recalled the sacrifices of the hundreds of thousands of Irish volunteers who were fighting with the Allies in the trenches of World War I. They have sought to interpret the mistakes, contradictions, bravery and megalomania that come to the surface in any rebellion. Regrettably, these complex themes have been reduced to black or white. Democracy versus dictatorship, freedom versus tyranny, treachery versus bravery, sectarianism versus inclusivity. The result is a crude, almost cartoon history. In the midst of this, sober reflection is drowned in a chorus of bitterness, suspicion and envy. Parading 2,500 soldiers outside the GPO this April will only add to this divisiveness. Why the reintroduction of the military parade, and why now? In her speech in Cork 2 weeks ago, President McAleese celebrated the Rising and its participants. Maintaining the event was a very radical assertion of the kind of republic a liberated Ireland should become. She seemed to suggest that it was responsible for everything, from the liberation of Irish women to the creation of a booming economy to our participation in Europe. She concluded that promoting the European ideal dovetails perfectly with the ideals of the men and women of 1916. She chose, it seems to me, to read history backwards, to make a direct connection between 1916 and a modern 21st century democracy. It was a boastful claim, and a dubious one. We are not in a position in 2006 to be boastful about tolerance and equality. Modern Irish republicanism has often been vague, contradictory, and ideologically incoherent. To deny this, to perpetuate the myth that it has been consistent, is counterproductive and dishonest. Easter week 1916 does not belong to any one group or any one political party. The event, and those who wish to commemorate it in all its complexity, have been demeaned by an exercise in political opportunism. The commemoration will tell us much more about Ireland in 2006 than Ireland in 1916. The row about the legitimacy of 1916 has failed to do justice to the complexity of the event and its legacy.
And that was Diarmuid Ferriter. Well, let's get a taste of public opinion. We decided to send our camera crew down to the GPO today, 90 years after 1916, to see what people were saying about the planned commemoration. Here's just a taste of what we heard.
Most countries commemorate major events in their history. Just the French commemorate Bastille Day. We should commemorate 1916, yes.
I don't know if a military parade is appropriate. in this day and age, but certainly we should mark it with some form of formal occasion.
Well, I know it's been kind of hijacked by other people and other parties since, but it still is a very important moment in our history.
I think it'd be a good idea. I definitely go on anyway.
To me, it really is something that's happened in the last century, and I think people today are so far removed from it that just I don't know if it's any great interest anymore.
I am from Poland, and to 1989 we wasn't free really, so I think the Irish people should celebrate this day.
And there were the views of a very modern Ireland being expressed there to us outside the GPO. Well, Diarmuid, Ferriter and Martin Mansergh are still with us. We're also glad to be joined by Eoghan Harris, political columnist for the Sunday Independent, and also Caoimhghín of Sinn Féin. And Caoimhghín, if I can start with you in reaction to what Bertie Ahern said in that Ardèche speech where he announced this planned commemoration. He said 1916 is not the property of those who have abused and debased the title of republicanism. He was referring to Sinn Féin, wasn't he?
Well, I think that what we should concentrate on here is the positive, and that is the fact that the Taoiseach and the government have decided to commemorate and to celebrate again the 1916 Rising. I think that we will serve no purpose in going back on his words, which I find regrettable and completely unacceptable. However, he has moved forward from that point and has now established an all-party consultative committee in order to address the programme leading to the 100th anniversary in 2016. But you accept the basic premise
that you no longer have a monopoly on 1916, that all parties in this country have roots.
That's only in his head and in other people's heads. People in Sinn Féin's ranks have never ever viewed 1916 as their property. We have never claimed any monopoly over the message, the principles and the ideals of the men and women of 1916. We have always celebrated and commemorated, and whether the government had taken these steps or not, we would continue and will continue to do that as people, Republican people, throughout the length and breadth of this island have done in every year, I understand, since the Rising itself.
Eoghan Harris, even those who won't describe themselves as traditionally Republican, there will be some people who think it will be a very good day when Irish democracy stands up and reclaims 1916 without the physical force tradition necessarily.
Well, that day hasn't come yet. I was very interested in that box pop there. There's a poll at the end of it. I can foresee a day when a Muslim, an Irish Muslim, will stand there and tell you that he supports suicide bombers somewhere else in the world, because after all, didn't the men of 1916 of my country, Ireland, as it will be his country, did the men of 1916 effectively commit suicide, or at least went out on a suicidal mission? Are they not in some sense related? I can see 1916 as there's two aspects. There's the one that Diarmuid Ferriter has talked about. There's the historical event, which should be left to historians, and then there's its politicised event. I reject the Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Labour Party notion that you can divorce 1916 and Pearse from the Provost.
Is an honourable attempt, at least, to try and take the kernel of justice and truth out?
I think it's not an honourable attempt. It's very difficult for me to do this because I have three relations out in 1916, grandfather, his brother, and my first cousin, Dick Forbes, who used to write for the Theatre Royal, the anti-German vaudeville during the war. So I don't reject my grandfather or my family's courage in doing it, but they were outside the political consensus of their time, and I'm outside the political consensus of my time, because everybody, I think most people in the country, want to celebrate 1916. I think it's very important the minority, of which I'm one, maintain that it's a bad idea, because it's very hard to separate Pearse and the Provost. I've never been able to do so. When I'm talking to young students, and especially young Republican students, they say if Patrick Pearse was able to go out with a minority and do that in 1916 and be retrospectively justified, why shouldn't any other group of Republicans do it and be retrospectively justified in Northern Ireland? As indeed I think the Provost could claim that the election results of Northern Ireland in some sense retrospectively justify their campaign for the nationalist population, but that doesn't make it right.
OK, could you stick with the motivations behind this decision to commemorate Martin Mansergh? That the problem is that the Taoiseach announced it at a Fianna Fáil Ardèche. From the very beginning, this commemoration has been party political.
Well, no, I mean, you make important public statements very often at Ardèche, and I think what he felt was that it is high time that the state reclaimed ownership and responsibility for its origins.
There's nothing to do with the fact that he knows there's a tough election coming up when Sinn Féin
I don't think you can see it in those short-term things. But I think let's be perfectly politically frank about it. I think there would be concern, and it's not just in Fianna Fáil, but in other parties, is that 1916, which led to the foundation of this state, becoming too closely associated with a different version of republicanism that was involved in conflict over the past 30 years, which I would have to say...
What's the difference between the men of 1916, the men and women of 1916, and the IRA of the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s?
I think there are two important differences. One, 1916 was about establishing the independence of a country which 2 years later a vast majority of the people showed that they backed. There wasn't even a majority of nationalists in the Northern Ireland that supported the IRA campaign. They only became the majority party in nationalism on foot of the peace process. They wouldn't have become so.
Both
they
groups,
have become
1916 and the present-day IRA, were flying in the face of public opinion in their times. That's the key similarity.
No, but the point is that the ideals of 1916, the Sinn Féin in 1918 went and campaigned on the ideals of 1916, and it received massive public endorsement. Public endorsement that the IRA in the last 30 years never received.
Caoimhghín.
Well, you know, I think that to go into drawing the analogies between, and there are obvious analogies between the situation in 1916 and post-1916, up to the 1918 election, I don't think, and beyond, I don't think that that's deniable. But I think this is all a distraction, you know, from actually talking about the real issue here. It's whether or not we should celebrate, commemorate the 1916 rising.
We want to know
and
what we're commemorating, don't we?
Well, this is the point I want to make. It was more than just the military endeavour. It was made up of all of the variety of strands of Irish nationalist expression at that time. It was both in terms of the language, it was in terms of the women's movement, it was in terms of sporting and cultural endeavour. It had many, many strands. It was not just a militaristic undertaking. And I think it's very important that recognising that it is welcome that the state are now to organise a military parade. I think it will be just as important in the minds of the Republicans that I am a voice for, as I would expect for many people throughout this island, that we would also address the other elements of celebration.
Dermot
and I would hope
those
that
other elements,
communities
you're quite
and
dubious
others
of
would
the
have a
link
role.
made by Mary McAleese, particularly between, let's say, the progressive movements of today and 1916. But she does say that, you know, she quotes the proclamation saying, guarantees religious and civil liberty, equal rights and equal opportunities to all its citizens. Very progressive kernel at the heart of 1916.
There was. The language was very progressive, and the guarantee that was going to be given to equality between the sexes and so on, has often been referred to, has the aspiration towards cherishing all the children of the nation equally. We've heard that quoted an awful lot. It's probably the most quoted part of the 1916 proclamation. The difficulty is that that was rhetoric, it was aspirational. Caoimhghín mentioned there the different strands that were going in to the organisation and the execution of the 1916 rising. It wasn't the Sinn Féin rebellion at all. We saw a little boy holding up a poster there with the Sinn Féin rebellion on it. It wasn't the Sinn Féin rebellion. It never was organised by Sinn Féin. And of course, retrospectively, they were very lucky that was being referred to as the Sinn Féin rebellion. What you're getting is a whole mixture of all sorts of different political visions. The language of the proclamation is perhaps the most clear and certain thing in 1916. Everything else is utterly chaotic. The rising itself was utterly chaotic. The personalities involved in the rising were often very chaotic. And what disturbs me most about a lot of this, I'm not against commemoration. I think it should be commemorated. I don't think that the military parade is a good idea. I think we've had enough militarism. But when you look at the actual what happened afterwards, when you look at the actual language, when you look at the aspirations and what was actually done subsequently, what we're doing is reimposing the certainty at a time when it didn't exist. And the further we get away from 1916, the more we seem to be absolutely sure in the present about what was going through their minds in 1916.
With Martin Mansergh, it is quite selective, isn't it, that when we talk about this progressive proclamation, we also ignore sometimes what Pádraig Pearse was saying in, you know, the coming revolution. Bloodshed is a cleansing and sanctifying thing of the nation which regards it as the final horror has lost its manhood. Now, in the context of global terrorism today, is that something we should
but I mean, you can quote a lot more noble sentiments of Pearse than that. I mean, from Tone and Tone and Davis and so on. And I mean, frankly, everybody who was involved in the First World War
was extolling sacrifice of that kind. I mean, the language was unfortunate, but as has been pointed out, Thomas Jefferson used very, very similar language. I think that there's too much focus on that.
But on this particular day,
on the question, can I just deal with the
Bertie Ahern stand up and say, I reject the things about Pádraig Pearse's statements, for example, that we need to reject, like this kind of language he used?
Well, look, I mean, with no patriot or hero of the past is anybody going to subscribe to everything and anything that they said, irrespective of who they are. I mean, well, I won't go into other examples, but I think what commemoration is about is it's not an exercise in pure history. That's for the historian. It's about picking out things that are relevant today, ideals that can be. Commemoration is always a hybrid. If you go,
history gives us that luxury, doesn't it? We can pick and choose among what we want to remember from events.
I think the commemoration 1916, the good commemoration is this kind of programme. I think a great democracy, and the Irish Republic is a good democracy. It's probably one of the few democracies in Western Europe, thanks to the constitutional tradition, which didn't have a bout of fascism or communism. The way the Irish Republic should celebrate 1916 is by debates like this, that allows the minority to express, and the unionist minority on the whole island, to express its reservation about 1916. Can I just make two further points? One is that I reserve the same caustic criticism for the cult of Michael Collins in Fine Gael as I do for 1916. I regard the cult of Collins, that kind of necrophilia, as bad as Fianna Fáil's appropriation in 1916 for political reasons. You know, glorifying gunmen is not a good way. Secondly, the 1916 Rising was, by any standards, undemocratic. 7 secret conspirators brought out 1,700 men, not just against the British, but against the majority tradition of the country. And they killed 314 civilians. That is to say, 5 civilians for every 1916 man that was killed.
You did mention,
and that's much the same ratio as in Northern Ireland.
Bring in another voice
the civilians
here, if I could.
killed more, the civilians get killed more than the IRA, Irish Volunteers.
I want to go back to your point about the unionist perspective.
Their lives were just as important as Patrick Pearse's.
We have one more perspective to bring in. That's the unionist perspective, which you mentioned. We're joined now by Edwin Poots of the DUP MLA. Edwin Poots, how do you see 1916 from your perspective?
Well, I don't think that there's necessarily much to celebrate, in that there was 450 people killed as a result of the Easter Rising, 250 of them civilians. In the aftermath of that, it ensured that Ireland would be divided for the foreseeable future, and 90 years later, Ireland is a divided state as a result of the Rising of 1916. We've also saw that Ireland became a monolithic state, in that over 70% of the Protestant population fled the Irish Republic as a consequence of the 1916 Rising and what happened thereafter.
But is Ireland not a very changed society now, Edwin Poots? And in some ways this is a sign of our maturity, that we can take the progressive things like the celebration of civil religious liberties and forget the armed force campaign.
Well, it's probably only changed in this last 10 to 15 years. Now, as a nation, Ireland failed for generation after generation, and its greatest export, of course, was its young people. And many of them chose to live in the tyrant England as such, and there's actually more Irish people living in England than there was living in Ireland at one point.
I just want to take you back to Mary McAlee's speech, if I could. Sorry to interrupt you, but I want to take you back to what Mary McAlee's talked about, the shared pride that we can feel in the men who made the ultimate sacrifice in the battlefields of the Somme and the Great War, and those who died for their ideals in 1916 in places like the GPO. Is that not a progressive, a good movement forward from your perspective?
No, there's absolutely no comparison. Those who went to serve in the First World War and to fight imperialism, be they from the 36th Division or the 16th Division, which represented both parts of Ireland at that time and encompassed all those people on Ireland, they went to fight in a war which was a just war as such, and a war where people were fighting on proper principles. What happened in 1916 Rising was an act of terrorism, and if I was a member of Republican Sinn Féin, if I was a member of the Continuity IRA or Real IRA, I would take real encouragement that the state was now celebrating terrorism from 90 years ago, because that small minority now might deem what they do and their illegal practices and activities would be glorified in later years to come. So what the state is actually doing is encouraging modern-day terrorists and modern-day terrorism to actually engage against Protestants
Stay with
and
us,
against
Eoghan.
Unionists in particular.
I want to put some of the points there to our panel, but first of all, Caoimhghín, there is an irony here, isn't there, that you could argue that by alienating Unionists with this kind of commemoration, you are setting back the ideals of the men and women of 1916, the Republican ideals, to bring forward the unity of this country.
Not at all. I don't accept that at all. But I would like to say that I welcome the fact that Edwin and the DUP have bemoaned the fact that Ireland has been partitioned, and look forward to working with them in the future to overcome that difficulty. A temporary one, I hope. Now, you know, to talk about 1916 and the promise and the hope and the expectation that it generated, I think we have to recognise that today that is largely unfulfilled. And I don't only mean in relation to the partition of Ireland and the fact that we still have a part of the island of Ireland that is under British jurisdiction. The reality of it is that many of the promises of the proclamation of which we've spoken have yet to be achieved. When they talked about the cherishing of all the children of the nation equally, they weren't talking about the under-10s.
But
they were talking about all
citizens here. By celebrating something which is about the use of weapons, abuse of guns, you actually are in some ways playing into the hands of Republican dissidents who reject your strategy.
I don't accept that. I mean, can I say to you that, you know, Republicans, and I've been a member of Sinn Féin now for many years, Republicans would have celebrated the Easter Rising of 1916, but I would also warrant that if 1916 never happened, the reality is that there would have been, at different times in our history, a revolt of nationalist and republican ferment towards the ideal of Irish independence and sovereignty. That is a fact of life.
That's a view that has been expressed by an awful lot of historians as well, that if this hadn't happened in 1916, there's a strong possibility it may have happened in 1917 or 1918. And it's something that we need to be aware of in the context of this debate about democracy, which Eoghan has raised as well. We have to be mindful of transporting a 21st century definition of democracy back to 1916. One thing that is being left out of this equation is the British government's intentions, British imperial intentions. Did they allow the practice of democracy in Ireland in 1916? They didn't. No. Democracy didn't exist in Ireland in 1916. And this is one of the difficulties with using present-day arguments and putting them back onto 1916.
But Martin Mansergh, the problem isn't that if you celebrate 1916 as the key factor, the thing that brought about democracy, you ignore the contribution of people like Daniel O'Connell and Charles Stewart Parnell and even John.
No, I don't think so. I think indeed the 1916 proclamation, if you look at it very carefully, acknowledges debt to different forms of struggle in the past. But I would like to sort of put the point to Edwin Poots. I mean, the Ulster Unionists were planning to establish a provisional government if the British Parliamentary Act of Home Rule went through. And I think it does need to be remembered that it was the resistance to the historic compromise of devolution within the Union, which was called Home Rule, and that the Ulster Unionists were prepared to cause civil war over that. That was in many ways the trigger for what happened, and I think it's a matter of very great regret that that attitude was taken at that time. And you know, people talk about 1916 being sectarian. Actually, I mean, the proclamation is remarkably non-sectarian. There is no mention of religion, but the Home Rule resistance was absolutely sort of steeped in Protestantism and Protestant state. And
there's a good point here, isn't it? Maybe in some ways by focusing on the things you don't like about Mary McAleese' speech, you've missed the non-sectarian things, the celebrations of what unites us rather than what divides us. Edwin Poots?
Sorry?
I was just saying that by concentrating, as your party leader did, on the negative aspects from your point of view of the Mary McAleese speech, you may have missed the celebration that she talked about of shared values.
Well, in terms of shared values, Mary McAleese may try to portray herself as a Mary Robinson, but certainly in the unionist community, the mask has slipped a number of times, and it first of all slipped whenever she accused us all of being Nazis, and certainly it has slipped again in relation to this.
Well,
what I find astonishing is that we have Democrats...
Lord Laird accused the 1916 Rising as being at the Munich beer cellar.
Everyone who's finished, we'll come back to you in a moment.
But
finish off
it is astonishing that Democrats are celebrating the actions of terrorism, and they're not celebrating what John Redmond and what the Democrats of that time done to achieve what other people in Ireland wanted to achieve. They're celebrating what terrorists done, not what the Democrats done, and that's what Martin Mansergh needs to respond to.
And what was the unionist attitude to John Redmond?
Thanks for joining us. I want to move this on to just another question here. We have a question of identity here, don't we? In Ireland today, in modern Ireland, what kind of things do we have to hang our identity on? What icons, what days? Is it Patrick's Day, Eoghan Harris? We do need something, don't we, that unites us around a concept of Irishness.
I don't think we do. I think we express our historical sense in every kind of way. I mean, modern Ireland expressed itself through the great success of U2 at the Grammy Award, John McGahern's novels, the novels of John Banville, or art, or literature, or culture, or Beckett's, or Behan's, or Yeats's, I mean, or football teams, or sporting events. We don't have to have this group of, in my view, suicide bombers, I mean suicide terrorists, because what at the end of the day,
that would be a terrible way to conclude
what at the end of the day was Pierce doing?
Owen to have that
what was Pierce doing
unacceptable.
What was Pierce doing except bullying us? Pierce and his men were like, as so many, a suicide saying to a family, do it my way or we'll kill ourselves.
No, they weren't.
And they were a crowd of
they were idealistic
bullies.
No, they weren't.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. I'm so sorry that we have run out of time, that has to be the last word, but this is not going to go away anytime soon. I'm very glad to join us, Caoimhghín Caoláin, Eoghan Harris, Martin Mansergh and Diarmuid Ferriter. Sorry to cut you off so quickly, but that's all we have time for tonight. Next news on RTE is Network News at 11:25. We're back at the usual time next week, but for now, from everybody at Primetime, a very good night.
Only Dick Keegas and Lee, dúsage George Morrison, Sean Lewis Gannon, Chomai le Caoláin Riada, sa léirú chumasach seo buinnig í soltas.